Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our next session of reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. Last time we met, last session before this one, we just finished book one. Now we're starting book two of things. Again, we're using the volume edited by Straussman, Landmark Thucydides. Let's start. Chapter one of, uh, of of book two. The war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians and their allies on either side now really begins. So, in other words, the, in book one, we mostly dealt with the background, the causes of the war. We get the character of both regimes. We get the two cities, Athens and Sparta, and their allies. We get a understanding of the Greece. We get kind of a prehistory of the Greek cities, their origins and how they emerged and how they developed, a kind of a historical account of how they emerged because of the terrain and the situation. He then explains the war. He justifies the war as the greatest war, the Peloponnesian War, more than any other war, and then the previous wars in history. He then deals with two big ones: the Persian War and then the Trojan War, and his great competitors, that of Herodotus and for the Persian War, and that of Homer for the Trojan War. He then gives a account of the cause, the event, some background to fight and put the seizing of Padonia and Patia and other places by the Athenians, and then the Croatian incident, the troubles in Croatia. He then goes out, explains how the Croatian incident and how this led the between the Corinthians and the Croatians conflict led the Croatians, who were not allied with either Sparta, they're outside the alliance system. Um, um, they appealed to Athens to help them against Carthage, not Carthage, sorry, against Corinth. Corinth is a sea power, as Athens is a sea power, and um, Croatia is a sea power. In fact, and that's the whole point. Now, then that incident happens, and the way he gives how it turned out, mostly for the advantage of the Croatians, and not really like half and half. And ultimately, then the Corinthians are angry because they are defeated and they don't get their way. Uh, then what happens here next is an account of the causes of the problems, um, the attempt by the Corinthians to get the Spartans to enforce the treaty, and then a kind of account of the history. So he gives another kind of thing about the history from the Persian Wars to the current war. Okay, so and he says that no one has ever done a really good job about this. Again, he criticizes. This is a kind of criticism of Hesiod for not addressing the things after the conflict of the Persians, just leaving it at the end of the Persian. And then he has a little digression about the two leaders. It ends with the Spartans basically convincing their allies to go to war, and eventually starting the war. Now, but again, that was all book one. Now, book two, um, we start the war. So, for now, all intercourse except those through mediums of heralds ceased, and hostilities were commenced and prosecution without intermission. The history follows the chronological order of the events by summers and winters. Now he's going to be going about this in terms of this, and this is 430. It begins in 431, the first year summer. Okay, so he does it like half years, summer and winter. So let's talk about the first year summer. Chapter two, the 30-year peace, which was entered into after the conquest of Euboea lasted 14 years. It was in the 14th year of the priestship of Christus at Argos, during the Euriphet of Anasius of Sparta, and in the last month of two of the archonship of Pyodorus of Athens. In other words, he's giving the kind of local history, the times, who was in charge, who was now the different things, the priestship at Christ and Argos, the Ephoret in Sparta of this, and the archonship of Pyodorus. Now these are sometimes the archon had certain limited restraints in Athens. The These are office holders of executive authority. Sometimes some limited, sometimes ceremonial, sometimes more judicial than anything else. 6 months after the Battle of Padilla, and just at the beginning of spring, a Theban force, a little over 300 strong, under the command of their Boltok, um, uh, 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 Path, Pathagelus, Thagilius, the son of Philidi, Phil, Philades, and okay, Diemporus, son of Onotorides, about the first watch of the night, made an armed entry into Platia, the city of Botia, in alliance with Athens. The gates were opened to them by a Palatian called Nauclides, who, with his party, had invited them in, meaning to put to death the citizens of the opposite party, bringing over the city to Thebes, and thus obtain power for themselves. This had been arranged through okay, Ura, Eurachthmus, uh, 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 Macus, Eurathmicus, son of Leonates, a person of great influence in Thebes. For Plata had always been at variance with Thebes, and the latter, foreseeing that the war was at hand, wished to surprise our old enemy in time of peace before the hostilities that had broken out. Indeed, this was how they got in so easily without being observed, and no guard had been posted. After the soldiers taking up positions in the agora, those who had invited them in wished them to set to work at once to go to their enemy houses. This, however, the Thebans refused to do, but determined to make a conciliatory proclamation, if it was possible to come to friendly understandings with the citizens. With their herald accordingly invited anyone who wished to resume their old place in the federation of all Botians to take their position beside them, for they thought that this way the city would readily join them. On becoming aware, chapter 3, on becoming aware of the presence of Thebans in their gates, all of a sudden, occupation of the city, the Plataeans continued in their alarm that more had entered than was really the case, the night preventing their seeing them. They accordingly came to terms and accepted the proposal, made no movement, especially as the Thebans offered none of them any violence. But somehow or other, during the negotiation, they discovered the scanty number of Thebans and decided that they could easily attack and overpower them. The mass of Plataeans, being adverse to revolting from Athens. At all events, they resolved to attempt it, digging through the common wall of their homes. And thus they managed to join each other without being seen going through the streets, in which they placed wagons without breasts in them, without the beasts in them, to serve as a barricade, and arranged everything else as seemingly suitable for the occasion. When everything had been done and the circumstances permitted, they watched their opportunity and went out of their houses against the enemy. It was still night, though daybreak was at hand. In the daylight, it was thought that their attack would be met by men full of courage and of equal terms of their assailant. while in darkness it would fall upon panic-stricken troops, who were who would also be at a disadvantage to the enemy's knowledge of locality. So they made their assault at once and came to close quarters as quickly as they could. The Thebans, finding themselves outwitted, immediately closed up to repel all attacks made upon them. Twice or thrice they beat back the assailants, but the men shouted and charged them. The women and slaves screamed and yelled from the houses, and pelted them with stones and tiles. Besides, it had been raining all night, hard all night, and so at last their courage gave way, and they turned and fled through the city. Most of the fugitives were quite ignorant of the right ways out, and this with the mud and the darkness caused by the moon being in her last quarter, and the fact that their pursuers knew their way about could easily stop their escape, proved fatal to many. The only gate open was the one which they had entered, and this was shut by one of the Plataeans driving the spike of a javelin through the bar instead of the bolt, and that even here there was no longer any means of exit. They were now chased all over the city. Some got on the walls and threw themselves over, but in most cases with fatal results. One party managed to find a deserted gate, obtaining an axe from the woman, cut through the bar, but they were soon observed. Only a few succeeded in getting out. Others scattered about in different parts of the city were destroyed. The most numerous and compact body rushed into a large building next to the city wall. The doors outside of the street happened to be open. The Thebans fancied that they were the gates of the city, and that they were passage right through to the outside. The Plataeans, seeing that the enemy in a trap, now consulted whether they should set fire to the building and burn them just as they were, or whether there was anything else that they could do with them. Until length, these and the rest of the Theban survivors found wandering the city agreed to an unconditional surrender of themselves and their arms to the Plataeans. While such a fate of the party in Plata, the rest of the Thebans who were to have joined them had all their forces before. In other words, joined them with all their forces betrayed by, in any case of anything miscarrying with the body that had entered, received the news of the affair while on the road and pressed forward to their assistance. Now, Plata is nearly 8 miles from Thebes, and their march was delayed by the rain that had fallen all night. So, for the river Espros had risen, and it was not easy was not easy of passage. And so, having to march in the rain, and being hindered the course of the river, they arrived too late and found their whole party either slain or captive. When they learned what happened, they at once formed a design against the Plataeans outside the city. As the attack had been made in time of peace, it was perfectly unexpected. There were, of course, men in stocks in the field, and the Thebans wished, if possible, to have some prisoners to exchange against their countrymen, should any chance have chance to have been taken alive. Such was their plan. But the Plataeans suspected their intention almost before it was formed, and becoming alarmed for their fellow citizens outside the city, had sent a herald to the Thebans reproaching them for their unscrupulous attempt to seize their city in time of peace, and warning them against any outrage on those outside. Should the warning be disregarded, they threatened to put to death the men they had at hand, but added that on the Thebans retiring from the territory, they would surrender the prisoners to your friends. This was the Theban account of the matter, and they say that they had an oath given them. The Plataeans, on the other, did not admit any promise in the immediate surrender, but it was contingent upon subsequent negotiation. The oath they deny altogether. Be this as it may, upon the Thebans retiring from the territory without committing any injury, the Plataeans hastily got in whatever they had in the country, immediately put the men to death. The prisoners, 180 in numbers, Eurythimus, the person with whom the traders had negotiated, being one. So this is end of chapter 5. Um, Uh, now let's go. Um, okay. This done, the Plataeans sent a message to Athens, gave back the dead to the Thebans under a truce, and arranged things for the city as seemed best to meet the present emergency. The Athenians, meanwhile, having had a word of had word of the affair, sent immediately after its occurrence, had instantly seized all the Boeotians in Attica, and sent a herald to the Planasians to forbid their proceeding to extremities with the Theban prisoners without instructions from Athens. The news of the men's death had, of course, not arrived, the first messenger having left just when the Thebans entered it, the second just after their defeat and capture, so there was no later news. Thus, the Athenians sent their order in ignorance of the facts, and the herald on his arrival found the men slain. After this, the Athenians marched to Plata and brought in provisions and left the garrison in the place, also taking away the women and children and such men as were least able bodied. Now, chapter 6. In the affairs of Plataea, the treaty had been broken by an overt act, and Athens at once prepared for war, as did Sparta by her allies. They resolved to send ambassadors to the king and to such others or of the barbarian powers as either party could look for assistance, and tried to ally themselves with the uncommitted states at home. Sparta, in addition to existing navy forces, gave orders to the cities that had declared for her in Italy and Sicily to build vessels up to a grand total of 500, the quota of each city being determined by its size, and also to provide a specified sum of money. Till these were ready, it was to remain neutral and to admit single Athenian ships into their harbor. Athens, on her part, reviewed her existing confederacy and sent embassies to the place more immediately round the Peloponnesus, Croatia, Sepinia, Archemenia, Zarissus, perceiving that these could be relied upon if she could carry the war all around the Peloponnesus. This is 132. We'll be looking at the next two chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9. Again, this is the first year of summer. Um, and if both sides nourish the bold hopes and put forward the utmost strength of the war, this the only was natural. Zeal had always had its height at the commencement of an undertaking, and on this particular occasion, the Peloponnesians and Athens were both full of young men whose inexperience made them eager to take up arms, while the rest of Hellas stood straining with excitement at the conflict of its leading cities. In other words, excitement, mostly through ignorance. Okay, very similar to what happened at the beginning of World War One. Okay, everyone's going, "Oh, that's national, yeah, yeah, yeah." Then what happens is then the hard reality of the war set in, and then oh my God, what have we got into? Okay, and there's not only the participants, but also the on-war, the other cities who weren't necessarily directly involved. They were looking at this the spectacle of this war. Everywhere, predictions were being recited and oracles being chanted by such persons as collect them. And this was not only in the contending cities. Further, sometime between this, there was an earthquake at Delos. For the first time in memory of in the Hellenes, of Delos had an earthquake. Now, this was said and thought to be ominous of the events impending. Indeed, now this, the Greeks understood. Now, in other words, let's talk about this for a second. That the earthquake and natural events and things like this were signs. In other words, the events of nature were signs of the gods, of the divine. Even things like some rain on a statue, looking at the gods crying, okay, or things like, in other words, a bird flying on a certain type of bird that's not a, in other words, things could be seen as symbolics. Plutarch makes not Plutarch, sorry, Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws talks about this, about how the Romans and other people were moved by the visual. Okay, so signs and therefore the events. Now, therefore, what happened here that the earthquake at Delos was seen as a big sign. It's indicating something. Instead of thought to be ominous event impending. Indeed, nothing of this kind had happened has allowed to pass without remark. Men's feeling inclined much more to the Spartans, especially as they proclaimed themselves to be the liberator of Hellas. So the Spartans are saying, we're the liberator. We're going to free all the Greek cities from this imperial Athens. Okay, because no, there's a little. I mean, the Athenians got their power. The Athenians, over time, what they did was they said, we're going to be doing the heavy lifting. If you're not going to be giving ships, then just give us money, and that once you're in the alliance, you're in the alliance. Okay, you can't get out in that sense, and the and there's a kind of hypocrisy here that a society like Sparta, who ruthlessly oppresses the Messenians, the Helots, and the way they exterminate them, like in a kind of, some critics of the Spartans. But this is a big thing. My friend Paul Ray, my friend, we know each other. He's older. He's older than me. Paul Ray has this wonderful multi-series things on Sparta. He really looks at Sparta as kind of an ideal, where Victor Hanson has the opposite position. He takes more of an Athenian view or Theban view. Um, um, I think even what's his name, Kagan, Donald Kagan, the old classicist at Yale, gave the view of this as kind of like on the side of Athens, and to some degree, if I remember correctly. But I could be wrong. I do remember it's been last time I read Kagan's 4-volume set, and his 1-volume kind of summary of the set was a decade ago. So um, therefore, this is a very important thing to understand about this war. Um, so let's go to where we left off. No private and public effort that could help them in speech or action was omitted. Even thinking that the cause suffered when he could not himself see to it. In other words, so general was the indignation felt against Athens, whenever by those who wished to escape from her empire or were apprehensive of being absorbed by it. Okay. Now this is now chapter 9, beginning chapter 1. Paragraph 1. Not paragraph, but sentence 1, section 1 of it. Now this collapses in this edition. Such were the preparations, and such the feelings which were which the contest opened. The allies of the two belligerents were the following. Not exactly. The allies, these were the allies of the Spartans. All the Peloponnese within the isthmus, except the Argives and the Achaeans, who were neutral. Pelines, being the only Achaean city that had joined in the war, although her example was uh, 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 um, followed by the rest. Outside Peloponnese, the Megians, the Lucretians, the Boeotians, the Phoenicians, the Phocians, the Ambraxiots, the Leucadians, the Anactorian, Anactorians. Of these, ships were furnished by the Corinthians, Megians, Scythians, Pethlians, Elians, Ambraciots, and the Lucerians, and cavalry by the Boeotians, Phocians, and Lucretians. The other states sent infantry. This was the Spartan Confederacy. That of the Athens comprised of the Chains, Lesbians, Plataeans, the Messalians, the Nepotius, most of the Archimedians, the Croatians, the Zacanthian, and some tributary cities in the following regions, namely the seapost of Caere with Dorian neighbors, the Ionia, area, the Hellespont, the Thracian cities, the islands between the Peloponnese and the Crete towards the east, and all of the Clades except for Milos and Thea. Of these, ships were furnished by uh, uh, Cleos, Lesbos, and Croatia, infantry and money by the rest. Such as the allies of the part. So that therefore, in chapter in basically in chapter 9 of the book 2, we get the sides, we get the alliances, the Spartans and the Athenian alliance. Okay, and then we get that. Now, so this is um, who's who and the thing of that. Okay, now let's go here. Okay, this is the map again. This is the map of the allies of who's who. Again, that's worth looking at if you had the book. Um, it Where is that? Let's go to a book right here. This is very early in the thing. Page 94 and 95 of the paperback edition. So that gives us that thing. Now let's do this. Chapter 10. Immediately, the affair at Petlaea, Sparta sent round orders to the cities and the Peloponnese and the rest of her confederacy to prepare troops and provisions requisite for the foreign campaign and to invade Attica. Several cities were ready at the time of the appointed and assembled at the isthmus, the contingent of each city being two-thirds of the whole force. And the whole army was mustered. The Spartan king, Archidamos, leader of the expedition, called together the generals of all the states and the principal persons and exhorted them as follows. This is Archidamos' speech. This is at chapter 11, and this is be continuing to end of chapter 11. So chapter 11 is the whole speech. Peloponnesians, our allies, our fathers made their campaign from within and without the Peloponnese. And the elder men among us here are not without experience in war. Yet we have never set out with a larger force than at present. And if our numbers and efficiency are remarkable, it is also the power of the city against which we march. We ought not to show ourselves inferior to our ancestors or unequal to our own reputation. But the hopes and attention of all Hellas are bent upon the present effort, and its sympathy is with the enemy of the hated Athenians. Therefore, numerous as the invading army may appear to be, and certain as some may think that it is our adversary will not meet us in the field. This is no sort of justification for the least negligence upon the march, but the officers and men of particular cities, of each particular city, should always be prepared for the advent of danger in their own area. The cost of war cannot be foreseen, and its attacks are generally dictated by the impulse, by the impulse of the moment, and are overweening and where overweening self confidence has despised preparation. A wise apprehension has often been able to make heed against superior numbers. Not that confidence is out of place in an army of invasion, but that an enemy's country. But in an enemy's country, it should also be accompanied by precautions of apprehension. Troops will, by this combination, be best inspired for dealing a blow, and best secured against receiving one. In the present interest, the city against which we are going, far from being powerless to defend itself, is on the contrary most excellently equipped at all points. So we have every reason to expect that they will take the field against us. And pardon, I'm gonna have a little. field against us, and that they have had that if they have not set out already before we were there, they will certainly do when they see us in their territory, wasting and destroying their property. For men are accustomed, for men are always exasperated at suffering injuries to which they are not accustomed, and upon seeing them inflicted before their very eyes, were least inclined for reflection, rush with the greatest heat to action. The Athenians are the very people of all other. The Athenians are the very people of all others to do this, as they aspire to rule the rest of the world and are more in the habit of invading and ravaging their neighbors' territory than seeing their own treated in like fashion. Considering, therefore, the power of the city against which we are marching, the greatest of reputation, which, according to the event, we shall win or lose our ancestors and ourselves, remember as you follow where you may be led to regard discipline and vigilance as to the first importance, and obey with alacrity the final orders transmitted to you, as nothing contributes so much to the credit and safety of its army when its soldiers, although numerous, quickly act on the orders transmitted to them. Okay, so that's the end of the speech right there. Now we go to 11. Dismissing the assembly after the speech, Archidamus first sent off Melesippus' son of Diocletus, a Spartan, to Athens, in case Athens should be more inclined to submit on seeing the Peloponnesians actually on the march. But Athens did not admit him to the city or to their assembly. Pericles, having already carried a motion against admitting either herald or assembly from Sparta after they had marched out. The herald was accordingly sent away without an audience and ordered to be beyond the frontier at the same day. In future, if those who sent him had a proposition to make, they must retire to their own territory before they dispatch embassies to Athens. An escort was sent with Lippus to prevent his holding communication with anyone. When he reached the frontier and was just going to be dismissed, he departed with these words: "This day will be the beginning of the great misfortunes of the Hellenes." And soon he arrived at camp, and Archidamus learned that the Athenians had no thoughts of submitting. He at length began his march and advanced his army into their territory. Meanwhile, the Boeotians, sending their contingent and cavalry to join the Peloponnesians, went to Pelata with the remainder and laid waste to the country. While the Peloponnesians were still mustering at the isthmus, or on the march before, they invaded Attica. Pericles, son of Xenothippus, one of the 10 generals of the Athenians, finding that the invasion was to take place, conceived an idea that Archidamus, who happened to be his great friend, might possibly pass by his estate without ravaging it. He might do either from a personal wish to oblige him or acting under instructions from Sparta for the purposes of creating a prejudice against him. In other words, instructions to creating against him, as had been attempted in the demand for the expulsion of the accursed families. He accordingly took the precautions of announcing to the Athenians in their assembly that although Archidamus was his guest friend, yet this friendship should not be extended to the detriment of the city, and that in case the enemy should make his house and his lands exceptions to the rest and not pillages, he at once gave up his up to the public to be public property, so that they should not be bring him into suspicion. He also gave the citizens some advice on their present affairs, on and the same strain as before. They were to prepare for war and carry in their property from the country. They were not going. They were not to go out to battle, but they were to come into the city and guard it, and to get ready their fleet, in which the real strength lay. They were also to keep a tight rein on their allies, the strength of Athens being deprived from the money brought in by the payments, and succeeded in war depending principally on collecting upon conduct and capital. Here, they had no reason to be despondent, apart from other sources of income. The average revenue of 600 talents of silver was drawn from the tributes of the allies, and there was still 6,000 talents of coined silver in the Acropolis, and 9,000 silver talent, 100, 700 of that had once been there, from which money had been taken for the Propetia and other public buildings, and for Podiata, the operation of Padilla. This did not include the uncoined gold and silver in public and private offerings, the sacred vessels and the proceedings of the games, the Median spoils, and similar resources to amount to 500 talents. To this he added the treasury of the other temples. These were by no means inconsiderable, and might fairly be used. Nay, if they were ever absolutely driven to it, they might even take the gold ornament of Athena herself, for the statue contained 40 talents of pure gold, and all of it removable. This might be used for self-preservation, and every penny or every little bit of it must to be of it be restored. Such was their financial position, surely a satisfactory one. They had an army of 15,000 hoplites, besides 16,000 more in the garrisons and the battlements at Athens. This was the number of men on guard at time of the first invasion, which was composed of oldest and youngest levies, and the resident aliens who had heavy armor. The the Phallicric wall ran from 4 miles before it joined the walls that ran around the city, and of the last nearly 5 miles had a guard, although the part of it was left without one, namely that long between the long wall and the Phaleric. Then there was the long walls to the Piraeus, a distance of some 4 miles and a half, the outer of which was manned. Lastly, the circumference of the Piraeus with Mauritia, which was nearly 7.5 miles. Only half of this, however, was guarded. And Pericles also showed that they had 1,200 horse, including mounted archers, with 1,600 archers unmounted, and 300 trimenes fit for service. Such were the resources of Athens within the different departments within the Peloponnesian invasion was implemented, and the hostilities have been condensed. Pericles also urged his usual argument to show that they would survive in war. Next 14. The Athenians listened to advice and began to bring in their wives and children from the country, and all their household furniture, even the woodwork of their houses, which they removed. Their sheep and cattle they sent to Euboea, and the adjacent island, but they also found it hard to move, as most of them had always been used to living in the country. 15. From the very earliest times, that was 14, this is 15, had been the case with the Athenians, then with others, under Cracops and the first kings, down to the reign of Theseus. Athens had always consisted of a great number of independent cities, each with its own town hall and magistrates. Except in times of danger, the king of Athens was not consulted. In ordinary seasons, they carried their own government and settled their affairs without his interference, sometimes even waged war against him, as in the case of the Eleuthians with Eulput against Erechtheus. And however, Theseus, however, had a king. They had a sorry. In Theseus, however, they had a king whose intelligence matched his power. And one of the chief features in his organization of the country was to abolish the council chambers and magistrates of the petty cities and to merge them into a single council chamber and town hall of the present capital. Individuals might still enjoy their private properties before, but they were henceforth compelled to have only one political center, named Athens, which thus he counted all the inhabitants of Attica among her citizens. So when Theseus died, he left a great city behind him. Indeed, from the dates of the Synagogue, Synorekia, the Feast of Union, which is paid for by the city, in which the Athenians still keep in honor of the goddess. Before this, the city consisted of the present Acropolis and the district beneath it, looking rather towards the south. This is shown by the fact that the temples of the other deities, besides that of Athena, are in the Acropolis, and even those that are outside it are mostly situated in the southern, in the quarter, situated in this quarter of the city, that of the that of the Olympian Zeus, that of the Pythian Apollo, of Earth, of Dionysus in the marshes, and the same of those honors of the oldest Dionysia are to this day celebrated in the month of um, Antesteron, not only by the Athenians but also their Ionian descendants. There are also another ancient temple in this quarter. The fountains, too, which since their alteration made by the tyrants, in Athens, the Palestinian tyrants kind of ruled Athens. They were kind of quasi-democratic. They went from a king to kind of Solon's reform, then the Pristidian, the series of tyrants, um, um, and that ruled Athens, and then they were removed by the Spartans, and then a kind of oligarchy, and then a new democracy was put in there, and then the rise of, you know, not before Themistocles, I can never say his name, the great democratic reformer, uh, 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 Callisthenes, and then Themistocles, right? This is the Persian War came, um, and then the restoration of Solon democracy. Then the Persian War came, and then with the rise of the naval power came the new Athenian state, right? And then this is the rise of a time now of Pericles. Um, this is the structure of this, right? And there other temples in this quarter. The fountain two, since the alterations made by the tyrants, have been called the Uran Aculos, no, Eneacunos of nine pipes, by which, when the spring was open, went by the name of Kelero, or fair water. Was in those days, from being so near and used for the most important offices. Indeed, the old fashion of using water before marriage and other sacred purposes is still kept up. Again, from their old residence in that quarter, the Acropolis is still known among Athenians as the city, the Polis. So therefore, this thing was called the Polis. Yeah, I think this is the city. That's the city, and in other words, this is the double meaning of polis. The Roman would call this the urb, right? The center urban area, the city, the Acropolis, and the city that is the city itself. The polis is a political entity. This involves even territory. This is why most Greek cities are not that urban. They're kind of. This is why Victor Davis Hanson's famous book, a very good book, The Other Greeks, who talks about that. And therefore, see, polis, we think city, and city means urban. It doesn't mean that. The polis as the political construct of the body politics of citizens. Okay, this is territorial. Therefore, they could be farmer based, very less not so urban, rural even. Where Athens, the center of that original part, the Acropolis, was a very urban area. That it was, remember how he describes this unification of it. So there, the unification of Athens into this thing. This has led some people to argue this that Athens is a nation. There's a very good. There's an interesting book called The Athenian Nation out there. That I don't necessarily. I think it stretches the point. Um, Athens is a political construction, not but that's what he's trying to argue. It's a people. It's that they're ethnically Ionians with some mixed other people. It's a mixed city. The Ionians are the dominant ones, the descendants of the place. But the structure of the Greek Athens is that all those other thing that merge together, and that therefore, Theseus, the great king, creates a great establishes a great order, but then Theseus is kind of forgotten in that sense, the king. So therefore, we have this discussion now at 16, chapter 16. The Athenians have thus long lived. The Athenians thus live long scattered along Attica in independent cities. Even after the centralization of Theseus, the old habits still prevailed. And from earlier times down to the present war, most Athenians still lived in the country with their families and their households, and were constantly not at all inclined to move now, especially as they had only just restored their establishment after the Persian invasion. Deep was the trouble and discontent about banning their houses and their temporary temples of the ancient city, and having to change their habits of life and to bid farewell to what each regarded was his native polis, native area, native area. When they arrived at Athens, this is 17, though a few had houses of their own to go to, or could find an asylum with friends or relatives, by far the greatest number had to take up their dwellings in parts of the city that were not built over and in temples and chapels of the heroes, even the Acropolis, and the temples of the Eleuthian Demeter, and other palaces were always kept closed. The occupation of the plot of ground lying between the Acropolis, called the Peloponnesian, had been forbidden by a curse, and there was also an ominous fragment of the Pythian oracle, which said, um, "It's better to leave the Pelasian ground unworked." Okay, this is an oracle of that oracle. In other words, it was better to leave that unworked. Okay, this too was now built over, but in necessity of the moment. And in my opinion, if the oracle proved true, it was the opposite sense to what was expected. For the misfortunes of the city did not arise from the unlawful occupation, but the necessity of the occupation from the war. And though the gods did not mention this, he foresaw that it would be an evil day for Athens, in which the plot came to be inhabited. Many also took up their quarters in the towers of the wall, wherever they could. For when they all came in, the city proved too small to hold them. And though afterwards they divided the long walls and a great part of the Piraeus into lots and settled there. All of this took place while the great attention was being given to the war, and the allies were being mustered, and the armaments of 100 ships equipped for the Peloponnese. Such was the state of preparations in Athens. Meanwhile, the armies of the Peloponnese were advancing. The first city they came into in Attica was Oino, where they entered into the country. Halting before it, they prepared to assault the wall with siege engines and other means. Orino, standing upon the Athenian and Boeotian border, was of course a walled city, and was used as a fortress by the Athenians in time of war. So the Peloponnesians prepared for their assault and wasted some variable time before the place. This delay brought the gravest censure upon Archidamus, Even during the levy of the war, had gained credit for weakness in Athenian sympathies by half measures he had advocated. And after the army had assembled, he had further injured himself in public estimations by his loitering at the isthmus and a slowness to which the rest of the march had been conducted. But all of this was nothing to the delay at Oinu. During this interval, the Athenians were carrying in their property, and it was the belief of the Peloponnesian that the quick advance would have found everything still out, and had not been for his procrastination. Such was the feeling of the army towards Archidamus during the siege. But he, it is said, expected the Athenians would shrink from letting their lands be wasted and would make their submission while it was still uninjured. And this is why he waited. But after once he assaulted Aron, and every possible attempt to take it failed, and so no herald came from Athens. He at last broke up his camp and invaded Attica. For this was about 8 days after the Theban attempt on Peleta had just in the middle of the summer, and when the corn was ripe, and Archidamus, son of Zexius, king of Sparta, was in command. Encamping in Illyrius and the Thracian plain, they began their ravages, and putting to flight some Athenian horse at a place called Reti, or the Brooks. Then they advanced, keeping Mount Eligilius on their right, although Cropia, until they reached Arch- Arcania, the largest of the Athenian demes or townships. The townships. Sitting before it, they formed a camp there and continued their ravages for long. So they're attacking one of the demes, the parts of the city. It's like they got to the suburbs of a big city and then started just crushing it, destroying it. Right? And the rest of the city, the main part of the city, the center of the city, is all walled up and has walls and protection set. Number 20, the reason why Archidamus remained in order of battle at Archaea during the excursion instead of descending into the plain is said to have been this. He hoped that the Athenians might possibly be tempted by the multitude of their youth and by their unprecedented preparedness for war to come out to battle and attempt to stop the devastation of the lands. Accordingly, as they had not met him at Illyrius or the Thracian plain, he tried to see if they would be provoked to a sally by a spectacle of a camp at Arcane. He thought that place itself a good position of encamping, and it seemed likely that such an important part of the city as had 3,000 hoplites of the Archaeans would refuse to submit to the ruin of their property. This area here, these people are the tribe, the camp of this part of the of their property, and would force battle on the rest of the citizens. On the other hand, should the Athenians not take the field in this incursion, he could then fearlessly ravage the plain in future invasions and extend his advance up to the very walls of Athens. After the Achaeans lost their own property, they would be less willing to risk themselves for their neighbors. And so there would be a division in the Athenian council. These were the motives of Archidamus's remaining at Arcane. In the meanwhile, as long as the army was at Ilus and the Thracian plains, hopes were still entertained, not of it not advancing any nearer. It was remembered that Pleonaxus, son of Panusius, king of Spartans, had invaded Attica with the Phoenician army 14 years before, but had retreated without advancing farther than Ilius and Thea, which indeed proved the cause of his exile from Sparta, as it was thought that he had been bribed to retreat. But when they saw the army at Archaea, barely 7 miles from Athens. They lost all patience. The territory of Athens was being ravaged before the very eyes of the Athenians, a sight which the young men had never seen before, and the old men, uh, and the old only in the Persian wars. And it was naturally thought a grievous insult, and the determination was universal, especially among the young men, to sally forth and stop it. Knots were formed in the street and engaged in hot discussion. For it was proposed for it the proposed sally was warmly recommended. It was also in some cases opposed. Oracles of the various imports were recited by the collectors, and found eager listeners of one or the other two disputants. Foremost in pressing of the sally were the uh, Archicanians, as consulting no small part of the army of the city. And it was their land. They were the hoplites. These rural people were the hoplites. These areas that were being crushed were the majority of the hoplite soldiers, not the sea soldiers, the heavily armed soldiers. Okay, this is the rural democracy. This is the rural part of the thing. The city urban area is the seaborne. This is more the vulgar, the masses, the ship commerce, the commercial. The farming element was out there. They were the hard army. And what happened was the Spartans invaded the farm areas and the hard army. And they were therefore the army wanted to go out and fight and liberate their land. Okay. Uh, uh, um, in short, the whole city was an excited condition, a state. Um, Pericles was the object of general indignation. His previous consuls were totally forgotten. He was abused for not leading the army out which he commanded, and was made responsible for all the public suffering. Okay, and this is the way it goes. He, meanwhile, seeing the anger and poor judgment just now in ascendant, and confident of his wisdom in refusing a Sally, going out there, going up, would not call either an assembly or meeting of the people, fearing the fatal result of the debate inspired by the passions, not prudence. So he was saying, listen, I'm not going to hold a debate right now. This is stupid. The passions would overrule. The passions will overrule the good judgment here. The men needs your good judgment. Pericles was a Democrat, but he was not a foolish Democrat in the sense that he just did not. In other words, he knew that the passions would, the anger of the passions could immediately upthray, and that significant parts of the city were having their interest harmed, and that therefore this is like a situation where, in fact, this is why Aristotle, in his book 7 about the city, says that they needs to divide the city up in two parts. In other words, there needs to be the inner section, the outer section of the city, right? And that everyone should have a part in both. Not that there should be, in other words, there shouldn't be a situation where citizens are only here or here, because that would divide the city. This is what happened. The city gets divided, and they have different interests. The outside seeing the outsiders are seeing their territories crushed and destroyed by the Spartans and want to do something about it. And in other words, this is the problem. This is the division. Pericles' strategy was simply hide behind the walls. They can burn it, they can do it, but that's not goes to. If we take an army out there and that's a recipe for us losing a battle. And let's not lose a battle. Let's let them get out there, rally, and while they're doing it, our navy are going to go attack their cities and attack their things, and therefore, and by the way, they can destroy us, but we have food from other places. Okay, but the problem here is that these people are losing their property and their things. It's there that's being lost, so they need to. They're going to have to really pay. That's like the means to get money to these people to alleviate their loss. They have to give them something in that sense. You have to buy them. You have to, and therefore this is why he's saying this in that sense. Um, uh, in other words, although he attended the defense of the city and kept it quiet as possible, although he constantly sent out cavalry to prevent raids on the land nearing the city from flying parties of the enemy, He had cavalry units go out there and making sure that they couldn't get to things. There was a trifle affair about Peloponnesian between the squadron the affair at Pegathia between a squadron of the Athenian horse in which Thessalian against the Boeotian cavalry, in which the former had raised the best of it until the hoplites advanced in support of the Boeotians, and then the Thessians and the Athenians were routed and lost a few men, whose bodies, however, were recovered the same day without a truce. The next day, the Peloponnese set up a trophy. Ancient alliance brought the Thessalians into the aid of Athens. Those who came along were the Lacusian, Parisian, the Cranians, the Parnassus, Geotarians, and the Phoenicians. The Cretan commanders were Polemides and Aristomus, the two party leaders in Lassus, and the Parsilian general was Menon. Each of the other cities had their own commander. In the meantime, the Peloponnesians, as Athenians did not come out to engage them, broke up from Elis and ravaged some of the demis, the townships, the areas between Mount Parnas and Brasilia. And while they were in Attica, the Athenians set off 100 ships, which they had been preparing around the Peloponnesus, with 1,000 hoplites and 400 archers on board, under the command of Canarius, son of Xenotimus, Protes, son of Ipicus, and Socrates, son of Antigenes, not our Socrates, but different Socrates. This armament weighed anchor and started on its cruise, and the Peloponnesians, after retaining in Attica as long as their provisions lasted, retired through Boeotia in a different road that as to which they had entered. They'd passed Arcubus, they ravaged a territory at Gria and held, which was held by the Ethiopians from Athens, and reaching the Peloponnese, broke up to their respective cities. They had retired after they retired from Athens, set guards by land and sea at the points which they intended to have regular stations during the war. They also resolved to set apart a special fund of 1,000 talents of the money in the. In other words, Athenians set up things. They set up special money. In other words, the Athenians retired. When they retired, the Athenians set a guard in the land points. In other words, I think they mean the Spartans retired, the Peloponnesian invaders retired. The Athens set guards in land and sea at the points which they intended to have regular stations in the war. They had resolved to set up a special fund of 1,000 talents of money in the Acropolis. This was not spent, but current expenses of the war, which were otherwise provided for. If anyone should move or put up the vote of a proposition for using the money for any purpose whatsoever except that of defending the city in the event of the city enemy bringing a fleet to make an attack of the sea, it should be a capital offense. In other words, killing. Capital offense means you get killed. So if you talk about touching this money, death sentence. It means that people can kill you. Remember, this time is not the killing. If you're condemned, if you're committing a public act, this is the difference. We today don't use capital. I mean, everyone there is a law enforcer. There's no police in our sense in the Greeks and Romans world. Every citizen is an enforcer of the law. So if this person is committing a capital crime, you can kill him. If the crime is committed, now you have to take him to trial. I mean, if you catch him in the act committing a capital crime, you're the law enforcer. And you're enforcing the law. This is this idea. In other words, everyone is the law enforcer. Every citizen is the policeman enforcing the law, has an obligation to enforce the law. So that if you see a criminal engaged in a crime, you just stop him. And if you have to, and he uses force against you, you kill him. And if it's a capital crime, you can use violence on them. You can. That's why in many ways crimes. There's no trials. There's no real criminals course. Their trials are mostly civic actions or accusations of public conspiracy or public corruption, rather than our stuff is robberies, The Greeks and Romans, robbers and those people, they were just dealt quickly. You caught them, you killed them. They were caught in a crime like this, or you took their property away from them, you took their money away from them, you made them a slave, or or to make them a slave, you have to bring them to authority saying you caught them. It'd be a quick trial like this because they'd have to defend themselves. There's no lawyers defending you. Yeah, because anyway, I caught him doing this and da da da. If you're going to make him they'd condemn him, and once condemned, he could be a slave. Okay, or he or she could be a slave, and this is how they did it. So therefore, this idea you can't touch the money. With that sum of money, they also set aside a special fleet of 100 Chemians, the best ships of each year, with their captains. None of these was to be used except with the money against which the same peril, should such peril arise. The ship, he kept a number of ships also. In other words, these ships are to be used at all costs for the defense of the city. So he created a situation of this money, and this anyone who tries to use money without there being that this is a capital crime. So therefore, this is how he's doing this thing. And I think we're going to stop here. This is where a good place to stop, I think. Hold on. I want to look carefully. Yeah, let's stop at 24. So if you have any questions, put them down below in the comments area. So I see them, I will comment them. If you like this, like it, share it with a friend. Subscribe more. You can follow me on social media. The information is below. You can support if you want to support this in a way. You can do subscribe star. I might be thinking about things like this. People are saying a couple of people came saying you should maybe do a kind of roundtable thing or something like this. I'm going to need help on that. So if I can, I know that there is someone said maybe you need to create a Discord server, and I had to create a Discord. There is a Discord server. I'm not telling you where it is because I'm not ready to do it. I don't have the smarts to police a Discord server, and this is when Discord. If you don't control your Discord server, this can be anarchy, and anarchy is never good. Okay, and I don't want to be a policeman and that stuff for a sense, but at the same time, you need to police and prevent porn and things like this. You don't want crazies and other things. I don't want to be associated with complete crazies. I don't mind talking with them or teaching them, but I'm not going to be allowing them. I don't necessarily going to adopt their or support their positions, but I'm not crazy. I think I am. Lefties may think I'm crazy, but I'm not crazy. So again, we're here. We're ending the first. This is book 2. We're at chapter 24 of the first book. Thank you and have a nice day. I think we went off longer today.